Everybody, we have got an awesome conversation with you today with the amazing historian and scholar Rick Bell. He just wrote a brand new book, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. It is a book for everyone to read. It really complicates American history, showing you the global reach of the American Revolution, all these things buzzing around that are beyond, say, the confines of what we know of as the 13 colonies. The conversation we have for you today is absolutely amazing. Rick is the best human being. You're going to love it. I'm just so thankful for him coming on today. So sit back and relax, because Reckoning with Jason Herbert drops right now. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions. And this is a Reckoning. All right, so you said you were actually recording this. What's that like? Are you already on tour for the book? Because the book we're recording on October 6th. The book releases November 4th. Like, what is this like for you? Like right now, actually.
You know, it's frantic and exciting, right? So yeah, we're doing a lot of prep, I guess, for the book drop in early November the 4th, and so that means I've been learning a lot of technological stuff about recording podcasts and trying not to say the same thing over and over again to different interested interlocutors there. So it's been a big learning curve for me. But anytime you get to talk about, the stuff you've been working on for the last however many years, 5 or 6 years, that's a good day. So. I love this stuff.
Yeah, I'll flip that on its side too, because I remember when Ed Zwick, he's a director, and he came on the podcast, and I was so worried about asking him the same questions he had been asked over, and eventually I was like, it doesn't matter. It's just ask the questions you want to ask, tell the stories you want to but I totally get that. And if other people are listening to other podcasts, first of all, shame on them. Shame on them. I have so many questions for you. I read this fabulous book that I'm holding in my hands right now, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. This is lovely, Rick. I finished reading this yesterday. Picked it up. I love what you do with this book. We're going to talk about this today and a whole bunch of other stuff. We're not going to talk about the whole book. I want people to read the dang thing. But before we jump into this, you want to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you're doing here?
Oh, sure. Where do we begin? Let's begin with full
the
day
very
of birth,
beginning.
Social security number, all that stuff. So I'm Rick Bell, Richard Bell professionally. If you find me online, I'm Richard Bell, but I'm Rick to my friends. Only my mother actually calls me Richard, I think, at this point in my life. And I'm originally British, actually, but I've been living in the US for a long time now, about 25, 26 years. I became a naturalized citizen about 8 or 9 years ago. I'm really proud of being a naturalized American citizen. One of the greatest days of my life was becoming an American citizen. I'm married to an American from Missouri, on the way to you in Colorado, not all the way, but getting there. And we have 2 terrifyingly American children who are 12 and 9, 2 daughters. And I'll say for the record that they have a British father, and so they can do really good British accents, my 2 daughters, but they'll only do them when they're making fun of me. So they do them quite often, as you can imagine.
I have a couple things to tell you. Actually, one, usually I'm well known for my love of Coca-Cola, but for today, knowing that you are from my ancestral homeland.
Oh, no.
I went with a spot of tea for you today, sir. So there's that. Not knowing if you were a tea drinker or not, but I thought I would reach across and so forth. And I've got a question for you. Has your accent changed since you've been in the States?
Oh, my God, yeah. First of all, I'll tell you, Jason, that I was going to bring a cup of tea as well. And then about 20 minutes ago in the hallway, I spilled it all over myself. So I'm somewhat damp, but I'm going to make it through today.
We'll call this episode Somewhat Damp with Rick Bell.
Which is fitting for the British climate, for instance, right? Somewhat damp, right. a rainy island off northwest coast of Europe. So yeah, I think my accent probably has changed. I know that because British people tell me that all the time. That whenever I get to go back and see all my family and friends who still live in Britain, one of the things they first say to me, and they do not say this with affection, Jason, is, "Wow, you sound really American." And to them, that is like, becoming Benedict Arnold in front of them, right? This is the worst possible betrayal. So I think that they hear the, subtle accommodations that my voice has made to living around other voices that sound together American, right? So whether that's language choices, like I'm just going to say reflexively pasta right now because I've lived here for so long. I'm not going to bother to say pasta. I'm going to say tomato. I'm not going to bother to say tomato and say no, I mean tomato. Just these small little things your brain does sort of semi-consciously without you knowing. So language choices have definitely changed at the sort of subliminal level. There's probably some accent choices and inflection choices that my brain has subtly sort of moved towards. Americans are famous for going up at the end of sentences, things like that. And I'm not sure I do that intentionally, but I bet I do that way more now that I live around Americans full time than, British people like to go down at the end of sentences so everything sounds very depressing and damp. And I like the sort of sunniness that's in a lot of American speech. But so when I go back to Britain, I definitely feel like I can be miscoded as an American tourist, which I do not like being miscoded as an American tourist. I want it to be the homecoming of the prodigal son. It's definitely not.
Yes.
Definitely not that. It's like, there's another American tourist here. Whereas I hope, Jason, in this country, I hope folks like you can still hear at least parts of my British accent here. The bits that still sound different from how you guys speak, that maybe it's sort of a mid-Atlantic sort of hybrid. And I got to tell you, that as a teacher of history, I teach at University of Maryland in College Park, right outside DC. As a teacher of history, I generally think that having a British accent has been an advantage, and a lucky, unnatural advantage that I've had as an instructor, because I think, I'm going to generalize here, I think many Americans hear a British accent and think that person's smart. Sometimes, in my case, smarter than I actually am. So with freshmen and sophomore students, they can hear they've got a British instructor and they think, oh, he must know what he's talking about. He's got one of those fancy British accents, like he's on Downton Abbey or something like that. But then there's a moment, Jason, at every point in the semester. Let's say I'm teaching like the U.S. survey, the first half of the U.S. survey, from the beginnings through the Revolution up to the Civil War and Reconstruction, which is always where I personally end. So that means that roughly every now, we're recording this in October, every October I will reach the sort of American Revolution portion of my U.S. survey curriculum. And 300 freshmen who have trusted their brilliant British accented instructor through, the Pilgrims, the Great Awakening, the Salem witch trials, they'll get to my lectures on the American Revolution. And that's when they'll hear my British accent in a whole new way. And you can watch this in real time if you're standing like over my shoulder in lectures. You can watch 300 freshmen gradually fold their arms like they're doing a wave at the stadium, like, no, we're not hearing this guy's take on the American Revolution. He must be spy sent by King George III or something like that. So there's that trust I've built with them, which I didn't really deserve prior to talking about the American Revolution, goes rapidly evaporates when they hear a British person talking about the American Revolution. And so, just to close the loop on this, I had the great fortune a couple of weeks ago to record my own book, to be the audiobook narrator for this book, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. And I'd lobbied hard for that. I wanted to be the narrator, because for my previous book, they'd hired an actor who was great, but who wasn't me. And I thought, I could do this. So I did it. And now I'm wondering if I made the right choice. Are any American consumers of the audiobook going to hear this British man talking about their founding fight and say, no, they're going to figuratively cross their arms? I guess we'll see.
There's so much here to unpack, and it's good because I only have you for the next, looks like 7 hours that I want to talk to you. I say regarding the accent, I say the same thing. I'm from Kentucky originally, and I very much made the conscious change to change my accent. I remember I was in high school and looked around and said, "Oh my God, I sound like the rest of these people," and got really interested in etymology of words, language, the subtleties of language, things like that. I'm a big nerd. It's like it's and on occasion I can let the accent out whenever I go back home to Kentucky and things like that, or I'm on the phone with my mother or something like that. Otherwise, this is most people have a hard time pegging me. And part of this was just like I didn't want people to think, "Oh, I'm dumb," but maybe there's some glory in being underestimated, I guess. Where I have to ask you, Rick, because where in Britain are you from originally?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was born in technically London, Enfield, which is a London borough, which is the very northern tip of London before you fall out of London into the home counties, as the counties around London are called. But I grew up just in outside of London in one of those home counties in a sort of working class neighborhood called Cheshunt. And then when I was about 11, we moved out to a fancier suburb a bit further away from London called Bishop's Stortford. And that's where I grew up. I went to high school in that little town. That little town, Bishop Stortford, not super famous, I think, even to British people, but certainly not to any international audience. And I'd say it's got two claims to fame, and both are a bit dubious. One of the claims to fame is that it's home to London's third airport. Now, most Americans, of course, can name two airports, Heathrow and Gatwick. But I'm pleased to tell you, Jason, that, and this is a bit of trivia your listeners should really focus on because it's very important. London has six airports. They are, of course, in order: Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, Luton, City, and Southend. And the third of those airports, Stansted, is right next to Bishop Stortford. It's the largest base for Ryanair, the budget airline that many people have been forced to fly on at least once and then vowed never to fly on again. That's based next to my hometown. And then the other, much more dubious reason that my town is in any way notable is that it's the birthplace of Cecil Rhodes, who is the person responsible for the British Empire, decimating Southern Africa in the 19th century. And to my lasting shame, when I was growing up there was a statue of him in town. I'm pretty sure they've taken it down recently. He's the equivalent of like a Confederate monument, but for the British Empire.
Oh, you and I have so many things we could talk about today that I am not going to force upon our readers. I made the mistake last year of I was driving around. I went to a national park back when they were open, and I ran into a British couple who were visiting us at Mesa Verde out in southwestern Colorado. I got talking to them. I was like, "Oh, my ancestors are from England," and the look they gave to me was like, "I've heard this so many times, and I've done the work, Rick. I'm a historian. I can tell you exactly." Like where we come all the way back to 1170. My maternal line is Chadwick is the name, and just outside of Manchester in Rochdale. That is like I know this area. I've yet to go, so I'd like to say that you and I are just two displaced Brits having a conversation. But that leads to the question here: like, why? What did you know that like? The American Revolution was going to be your bag? Like, how does this happen for you? How do you come to I have to assume that you love talking about the revolution. You've written on it extensively. How does a British dude come to want to talk about this?
Through the back door, I guess.
Okay.
One way of saying that, it's a surprise to me as much as you that this British person has written a book about the American Revolution. But it's the result of, I guess, going on some sort of journey. I hate to sound, too reflective, a journey of self-discovery, etc.
Please.
But I came to American history, period, very circuitously. Over in England, where I was born, where I was raised, where I went to K-12 schooling and university, I was not exposed to American history at all in any classroom curriculum setting as a young kid. It's simply the case that, outside the United States, studying U.S. history is not a priority, right, for people in other nations necessarily. And that shouldn't really surprise us, I guess, especially when you hear that, at least where I went to school, studying British history was the priority, right? That every nation tells its
Makes
school children
sense.
certain stories about its own past, and that dominates the curriculum. We can probably all recognize that. So when I went to K-12, and I should say for the record, I went to a fancy private school, a sort of budget Hogwarts sort of place, where they set their own curriculum, but it was still pretty similar to the curriculums that state-funded schools. We studied the Tudors. My recollection of the history classes I went to as a kid, I'm thinking, like 8th, 9th, 10th grade, was we started with the Tudors, where we saw, King Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, defeat Catholic France, the great enemy, then defeat Catholic Spain, another great enemy, then defeat the Pope. My God, what a hat trick of defeats of tyrannous Catholic-related enemies. And then, this is the bit that is wild to me in retrospect, and then having done that, we skipped forward. We pressed fast forward on the tape because they had video cassettes back then, and we jumped straight. We jumped straight to World War II, like no hesitation. Tudors this week, next week, World War II, and World War II, of course, is comfort food for British people, right? Because in World War II, Jason, I know you're a student of this, you know that Britain single-handedly defeated the Nazis without any help from any
That is
other
as I
country.
understand it. That is correct.
Those are just the facts, right?
Right.
We're being sarcastic here, but those are just the facts. So that was the factually limited version of World War II that I was told, and all my my little friends were told as well. It's a great moment for Britain if you tell that version of World War II. Britain triumphs over another evil, scheming European enemy. It's not French Catholics this time. It's the Nazis and Hitler, and prevails. It's a plucky sort of David and Goliath story where Britain is surrounded on all sides and yet somehow beats back the tyrant. This is the same back in the Tudor period as well. So you can see a sort of theme to my K-12 education over there. And what's missing, of course, was everything in the middle. What's missing is literally 400 years of colonialism, empire building, slavery, and of course everything American within that, including the revolution itself. So it wasn't like I was told some skewed pro-King George version of the American Revolution as a kid. I was taught nothing, just nothing, blank space, terra incognita when it comes to American history and the revolution as a whole. And then my recollection, Jason, is I barreled into college. I went to Cambridge, and I barreled into college studying medieval European history. So I refused to be sucked into the British history vortex, and my great rebellion was to do European history. That's the great rebellion here. So I studied, like medieval social history, peasants, sex, and death, and violence. And if you're 18, peasant, sex, and death and violence sound pretty good, I think, to most 18-year-olds. I studied a lot of that. I loved it. I learned a lot, met some great people. But came a point, at some point in my, 3 years, British colleges are 3 years, if I'm remembering correctly, education, where I basically ran out of courses on medieval European social history. I'd taken all the ones I could take. I was terrible at languages, so couldn't actually take courses where knowing Latin or Norse or
Thank you for that.
French, the real advanced stuff. So I needed a few more credits to graduate, and I sort of looked around the course catalog for a course where I could study something social history-like. I could study, maybe some peasants, maybe some sex, maybe some death, but a course that wouldn't require any advanced languages, and that, like any college student, Jason, didn't meet too early in the morning, right? Nothing like before 11 a.m.
Nothing,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Any instructor will know that is how students pick their classes since time immemorial. Not too early is a criteria. And so I found a course that, as I recall, met like 11 a.m. twice a week. I thought I could get up for that. I could set an alarm. I could be there by 11 a.m. if I really, want to learn something in college. And it was a history of colonial and revolutionary America. And it was taught by the late, great British social historian Betty Wood, a working class northerner from a tough upbringing who'd made herself into one of the great historians of colonial American society. And she taught me a lot about sex and death and American peasants. She called them colonists, not peasants. And I quickly realized how fascinating American history is and was, and how complicated, how important, how nuanced it is, and couldn't believe that they've been not teaching us this stuff for however long in British schools. So I got hooked really quick. Decided to continue those studies, get a PhD in American history, go to America to do it, and probably at some point when I made that decision to go get a PhD in America to study American history, I told myself that I'll go get this degree in America and then I'll come back to Britain and I'll find a professor job or a teaching job in the UK teaching British people about American history. That was probably the grand plan. But of course, in the course of getting that degree, it gradually dawned on me that there aren't that many jobs teaching American history outside of America, or at least in Britain. There was a strong lack of interest, I would say, at the university level in American history, especially early American history, and that the chances of me getting some dream job back in Britain teaching American history were pretty slim, whereas the US job market, however pitiful and messed up it was at the time, looked more likely. So I should take my shot in the US rather than the UK. And then, of course, I met a woman. This is how the stories go. We're now married. We have 2 American children, et cetera, et cetera. But my mother, if she was being interviewed by you right now, Jason, if we were sitting next to each other on a couch somewhere, she would jump in and say, well, I remember when I took him to Heathrow when he was headed off to go get his PhD, and he went through security and he turned a corner, and I said to Richard's father, I said, he's never coming back. And she seemed to know, or claims she knew, that I'd actually bought myself effectively a one-way ticket to build a life in the United States when I set out just to get a degree in the US, hoping to come home. That's the immigrant myth of return, right? Those of us who are born in one country and end up going to another, we always think we can turn around and undo it. We always think we can go back home. And most of the time we find out that actually we bought a one-way ticket, which for me has been a blessing. I've loved my time in the US. The US has been extremely good to me.
You bring up this wonderful idea I have now, which was we should do a subsection on this podcast called Historians and Their Parents, because we have the learned scholars, the absolute experts of their fields, right? And then we could have their parents telling us all the ways in which they are wrong, all the bad decisions they've made in their lives, all the I told you so. Like this would be
He never picked up his laundry as a kid, right?
Right.
You see this with Travis Kelce, right? Doesn't Mama Kelce come on the podcast sometimes and talk about Travis as a boy? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know some of the parents of some of the historians out there. So yeah, we could. This sounds like this would be trouble, actually.
That'd be wild, yeah.
It's funny you talk about all of the victories over the evil Catholics, and of course you end up in Maryland, of all places. People who are listening in who don't know much about the early colonies, like Maryland was the Catholic colony. But I want to ask you this, Rick. You talk about how the American Revolution's not well taught in England, and I get that, right? English history is so expansive. There's so much to cover.
That's
and
right.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, it's almost comforting to know that in England, people are really struggling with talking about the nation's collective past, right? The empire's collective past when it comes to colonization, slavery, all of these things that are difficult because there's still a statue of Robert E. Lee on my courthouse square in Murray, Kentucky. But when you have students come in to your introduction to American history, or the survey, the first half of the U.S. survey, like what observations have you made about these amazing young people, sometimes older folks, who come into a classroom and sit down with you and say, "All right, I want to learn American history. I want to learn about the Revolution." I'm assuming you take some courses on the Revolution itself. What do your students know? Have you noticed anything at all?
Yeah, I mean, I've been at this for, almost 20 years teaching now
Mm,
here at University of Maryland. I love my job and I love my students. I have great students, and every day I get to go in the classroom and spend time with them. That is a good day. I just came out of class like 20 minutes ago, right before I
awesome.
poured the tea all over myself. I had a great two-hour class using the life of Ben Franklin with a bunch of senior history majors to explore, 18th century social worlds. We were talking about uh, code switching and gentility and the common interest, using Franklin just as a vessel to talk about other important themes. And they were so smart and so on point. But I think they would be the first to say that they hadn't necessarily gone deep on many of these subjects before coming to college. And that's fine, right? College is a time for going deeper and learning more and thinking more completely and with more complexity. So I hesitate to generalize here because you meet students with all different backgrounds and different knowledge bases. And of course, like at any great school, not everyone's born in the US and not everyone came through the American K-12 system. But I would say in general, my students are often surprised to hear just how complex and messy and sort of far-reaching the American Revolution in particular was, because through the curriculums they've been exposed to, which in several states are set by elected officials rather than professional scholars, there's a tendency to simplify and sanitize there. And if we could really caricature it, we might say that, that the high school version of the American Revolution is um, George Washington wins the Battle of Yorktown. Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. Bish bosh, job done. That there's really just two or three set pieces in the American Revolution. And obviously, they're not in the order I just recounted them, because that would be back to front. And each of which involves a founding father, each of which involves some sort of bloodless sort of set piece in which very few uncomfortable or unusual actors are involved. And what that simplifying, sanitizing narrative adds up to, I think, is the idea that every American was a patriot. The British were tyrants, just like it says in the Declaration of Independence, and the plucky colonists, against the odds, defeated all the king's horses and all the king's men, all on their own. And that is lovely. That's a lovely romantic myth, just like the myth of the British Empire that I got when I was a kid in Britain. But it doesn't mean any of it holds up to much academic scrutiny. And so I think students are really hungry for complexity. They're hungry to sort of go back and relearn things with greater nuance and intellectual acuity that they bring to the table. So trying to globalize the American Revolution, which is one of the things I do in my classes about the American Revolution, I think is often a fairly eye-opening experience.
I think you make some really good points there about, I've got a 17-year-old son and a 13-year-old son, the younger of which, Rick, is named after Benjamin Franklin. Young Benjamin Chadwick Herbert.
If I've had a boy, he'd be named Benjamin for the same reason.
Yeah. And can I tell you, actually, I think Ben is actually more named after the Ben that we see in the John Adams HBO series. More than he's named after a fellow Brit, Tom Wilkinson's version of Ben Franklin, right?
Yeah, Tom did a great job. Tom just passed away like a year ago, I think.
He did. What a loss. One of my favorite actors. But I wonder, you really bring up some good points here. About the role of education, say in K through 12 here in the States, or maybe even back in Britain or elsewhere, right? That it serves an educational purpose. Let's teach you, but the motivations behind it, Rick, as we're talking here, sounds so much more of let's inculcate patriotism, perhaps a nationalistic identity by what we are choosing to focus on in the classrooms. And of course, history is hotly debated right now throughout the country, right? And I think that a lot of educators, both secondary educators, collegiate, are wrestling with how do we maintain the storyline here?
Yeah, wrestling is the word there, right? So I want to be clear. You find me a nation which doesn't, take that sort of motivation into account in its educational system in some way. The US is not unusual or exceptional in doing the things I describe. Britain is not unusual or exceptional in doing the things I describe. And yet there's a real tension there in all these systems between the imperatives of nationalism and national pride and history teaching in all its messy complexity there. And I think teachers are often on the front lines of that wrestling match, right? They have. I'm married to a teacher, by the way. Many people in my family are teachers, so I speak with some knowledge of this. There's a tension between what teachers want to teach with all that complexity and nuance and contingency, and the curriculums they're bound to, which often maybe pull in different directions. So teachers are often wrestling with this on the front lines, and so I'm lucky that I'm in a college environment where I have complete control over my curriculum. That is a blessing that not many educators have. So I'm grateful for the work they do in the classrooms and all that they manage to achieve in difficult circumstances.
Rick, as I understand it, there are a total of 4 other books on the American Revolution ever written.
That's right.
Which is great that this is the 5th one. But that does bring up a real question, right? And I wonder about this as a fellow historian, right? When you're sitting down, okay, I want to tackle the American Revolution. I've got a target audience here. For those of you listening in, this is a book for everybody. I love that about this book. But I wonder if you can kind of step us through the process for yourself as a historian, where you talk about like, what was the germination of this idea to tell this very large global history of the American Revolution? Like, there's got to be a level of chutzpah where you're just like, okay, I can take this on, right? And so, yes, I'm a Kentuckian, and I'm down with the Yiddish. So,
right, yes, I'm not going to attempt the same move. Let me tell you.
But what I guess what was the impetus where you're like, hey, I want to tell this story, and here's why.
Yeah. So I think, again, 20 years in the classroom suggest that the stories, plural, that I try to tell in this book are stories that are not well known among people who've come out of K-12 education environments in the US and not known among adults. I do a lot of work with lifelong learning groups around the country, especially on Zoom these days, getting to talk about some of these, globalized ways to think about the American Revolution. And adults of all ages say, this is fascinating. How did I not know this stuff before? So I sort of, wrote the book to sort of collect all these ideas and narratives and arguments about global entanglements of the revolution in one. So I was at the same time, deeply immersed in reading the historiography, right? The writings about the American Revolution, written by, as you said, these 4 other books about the American Revolution.
That's correct.
But in practice, as we know, there's been hundreds and hundreds of pieces of original scholarship over the last, 20, 30 years that in some way or other have expanded the board when we think about the American Revolution. So here's a good example. We've known in professional historical circles for about 20 years or so about the story of a guy named Harry Washington. And Harry Washington, someone I devote a chapter of my book to. I'll just tell folks who Harry Washington was, and then I'll situate it back in the historiography. Harry Washington, which is not his real name. Harry was born in West Africa. He would have had a Senegambian name originally given to him by his mother and father. He was kidnapped by slave traders in roughly the 1740s, is traded across the Atlantic, sold in the Potomac, and is purchased eventually by George Washington. George Washington, who calls him Harry, so I'm going to call him Harry Washington just for the purposes of clarity here, keeps him as an enslaved ditch digger, then an enslaved stable hand. And when the American Revolution breaks out in 1775, 1776, Harry is one of maybe tens of thousands of black captives who use the chaos of the war to liberate themselves, to run away. And he joins the British Army, which is welcoming these sort of freedom seekers for strategic reasons. He evacuates with the British Army to New York. When Britain loses the war, he evacuates to British Nova Scotia, and he eventually ends up in a new British colony for black fugitives of the American Revolution, known as Sierra Leone, and is very rightfully discontented with his second-class treatment there, and leads what we can think of, in crude terms, as an independence movement against the British Empire in 1800. An extraordinary global story of one man's odyssey through the American Revolution. There should be a movie, Jason, about him. There's not. And I will just say, we know that because of the extraordinary scholarship of a couple of historians, Cassandra Pybus, the great Australian historian, being by far the most important scholar of Harry's life. Harry was a character in a book she wrote about 20 years ago called Epic Journeys of Freedom, and many historians know something of Harry's story as a result of Cassandra's heartbreaking work. But that story, that important story, I don't think is broken through yet to mainstream. So one of the goals in writing this book is to pull together the astonishing scholarship of like a small army of specialists in one different field or another, and sort of synthesize them under the umbrella of thinking of the American Revolution as a global conflict. So I'm trying to showcase the work that Cassandra's done and that dozens of other scholars working in dozens of different fields have done, whether the field is, India or Ireland or Britain or Jamaica or whatever else it might be. So this is a chance to sort of have ordinary folks who might pick up this book in a Barnes and Noble or in the airport or something like that, get to confront what professional historians like you and me have known for some time about all these interesting aspects of the revolution that haven't yet made it into the core narrative that we consume publicly.
Well, I have to tell you, one of the great joys of reading the book, Rick, was as a professional story with who has an emphasis on early American history myself. There were so many stories in here, Rick, that I did not know. And that was, for me, that's a joy in coming to books, especially chapter on India. There are always these stories I hear. It's like, oh, India's this reason. I want to talk about India today for a few different reasons. I guess it's one of the fascinating chapters in the book, and I guess one of the questions I have for you is, you're not just a teacher to students at the University of Maryland, right? So I kind of wonder, when you're engaging with the public and inevitably it comes up, say, hey, I'm a historian of early America, blah, blah, blah. Are there popular misconceptions that you often hear about the American Revolution that kind of influence maybe your need to a desire to write the book or set a record straight or something like that? How does that come about?
Yeah, I mean, it's never confrontation. It's never
Sure.
Let me tell you what actually happened.
That's
right?
That's what I do at the bar.
After
Actually,
a couple of drinks, yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I'm not a confrontational person. I don't think that's a useful teaching tool, right? I think,
No.
What I hear in those conversations with lifelong learners, with students, with whomever, is excitement and curiosity about the American Revolution. The American Revolution is something we all care about, and I love that about this topic, right? Because it gives us a place to start for another conversation that can take us beyond what we already knew. And I've just got to say, as I was writing this book, I learned tons of things I had no idea because I drew on expert scholarship by people who took me down rabbit holes I would never go down.
Isn't that the fun part?
On my own. Yeah, it's the fun part. Absolutely. This book was a joy to write because I got to learn so much along the way. But I think when it comes to sort of preconceptions about the American Revolution, I think I've probably already named the two big ones I get most often. And that is the presumption that everyone was a patriot, and that therefore we can talk about the Americans fighting the British, when I think decades of scholarship in what's called loyalist studies, which is one of the hottest subjects in the American Revolution historiography right now, has shown that that's just nonsense, right? People always ask me for numbers at this point in the conversation, and I have to say, well, our numbers aren't very accurate, but okay. We think that in 1776, among the white population of about 2 million colonists, we think about 40% were patriots, a rapidly growing number because it had been very small just a year earlier, but the other 60% were not patriots. And there was 40% of people who were neutrals or independents. Today we'd call them swing voters, I guess. And there were 20% of people who were diehard loyalists, right? As diehard as the patriots were on the other side, right? So this is a very contested war. In fact, it's very common among scholars of loyalism to call it a civil war. That the American Revolution is a civil war among Americans, among subjects of the British Empire, right? And yet we all know that, but we've also sort of whitewashed it out of our lexicon. We tend to use patriots as a synonym for Americans and colonists, where in fact they're a vocal minority, at least at the start, of the American colonists who are fighting with each other over this. So that's, I think, one interesting jumping off point for a way we complicate our understanding of the American Revolution. And loyalists are one of the groups of people that in this book I try to give some real airtime to. The last chapter, one of my favorite chapters in the book, follows a woman from what begins as a neutral family, the Shippens of Philadelphia, who becomes ever more loyalist the more that neutral families get lumped in as loyalists by the patriots, who see everyone who's not a patriot as the enemy. And the Shippens do become more loyalist. And Peggy Shippen, the elder daughter of this family in Philadelphia, then marries Benedict Arnold, the most gifted combat general on the Patriot side. And soon after their marriage, he flips and becomes, a traitor to the Patriot cause. And many scholars think that Peggy has a lot to do with that flipping. So I put Peggy center stage and follow her around the remnants of the British Empire as it crumbles around her ears when she's in Philadelphia, when she's in New York, and then she's bounced to London, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and then eventually dreams of sending her children, who have the last name Arnold, out to India to rebuild the British Empire afterwards. So that loyalist thing is something I always want people to keep in sight when they talk about the American Revolution. It's a civil war among the colonists as well as anything else. And then the other part is that the Patriots do this without any help. But we all know that's wrong. We all know that's false, because we've all heard at some level either the story of the Marquis de Lafayette, who's in Hamilton the musical, therefore quite popular, this French volunteer who goes to join George Washington's army, and presumably he's not alone. Presumably there are other Europeans who volunteer to join George Washington's army, and that's true. There were lots and lots of them, and they often provided the real military skill, for instance, to build artillery units or build a cavalry that the Continental Army hadn't yet acquired on its own. And then we all know at some level, I think, Jason, that the French as a country, not just a group of individuals, but as a country, were involved. And it turns out that's the tip of the iceberg, that this, to borrow an old George W. Bush phrase, is a coalition of the willing, right? That there's a team of often rivals lined up alongside George Washington, all so they can stick the boot into the British Empire when the British Empire is most distracted and weakened. And that list has Spain on it, and you mentioned India. One of the most surprising things is to see just how much certain South Asian princes and rulers were involved in allying with France or Spain against the British. So effectively proxies of George Washington.
Yeah, okay, so, you mentioned a little earlier about the idea of the Civil War in the Americas. But, so much of what the book really unveils is this idea of the American Revolution as a world war. The first chapter, not to spoil anything, but the first chapter starts in China. And I'm like, wait, what? Which I absolutely loved. And Rick, we don't have time, and I would never even want to spoil the entirety of the book by going through the entirety of the book, because there's so much here, right? But I wonder, maybe actually we talk about India. If we can talk a little bit about like what India's role is here, because I think this is one of the real hook for me. India's this far off place, and of course, as an American, it's like, okay, it's a fellow colony and blah blah blah. And I've got a lot of friends of Indian descent, or so forth. But like, can we talk about the role that India plays in the American Revolution? Because I think this is fascinating stuff.
Oh, I do too, right? And there's been so much great work by historians who specialize in the history of colonial India in that period that I've been drawing on to do this. So I'll just tell you a quick story, Jason. And this is how I think that chapter 12 or 13 of the book begins, which is the India chapter. And it's a scene on the Philadelphia dockyards in, I think, 1782. And they're trying to come up with a new name for a newly retrofitted ship that's going to defend Philadelphia from a British naval attack. And they want to name it after one of their allies to remind the Patriots that we've got a coalition of allies now. We can beat these British back. But they don't name it after the Marquis de Lafayette, this little ship in Philly in 1782. They don't name it after Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish victor at Pensacola, who's also a critical ally. They don't name it after King Louis or the Comte de Vergennes or anyone from the Netherlands. They name it after Hyder Ali. Hyder Ali. And they call the boat the Hyder Ally, which is their sort of anglicization of that word. And Hyder Ali was the Muslim ruler of the Kingdom of Mysore in India, in South Asia. An Indian kingdom about the size of, I think, Pennsylvania and South Carolina combined, which had long detested the British East India Company, and it had a party when France joins the American war on the Patriot side and starts sending ships around the world to anywhere flying the British flag to have a crack at British territories. So the French Navy is basically coming to India, and Hyder Ali says, well, this is the perfect time for me to stick my boot into the British East India Company in India as well. And he forms a formal alliance with France, who's formally allied with George Washington. So by the transitive powers of international diplomacy, this Muslim prince is basically allied with George Washington because they all have a common enemy, King George and the British mega corporation, the East India Company, that is basically the face of British power in the Indian subcontinent at the time. And Hyder Ali, Jason, turns out to be a formidable enemy of British territory and trading interests in South Asia. He kicks the British East India Company up and down the subcontinent, sometimes with French help, sometimes with not nearly enough French help. And that's why over in Philadelphia in 1782, they are gratefully naming their newest battleship after this guy, what must be 10,000 miles away. So a truly local manifestation of a global entanglement. And we know from reading the Philadelphia papers that everyone in Philly knew exactly who they were naming this ship after, because his name had been all over the news over the last 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's one of the real strengths of the book. There's a chapter on piracy, on private, and to talk about this, the Patriot cause understood the importance of spreading out, because if Britain can concentrate all of its energies in Virginia or in New York, this is going to be game over pretty quickly, right? So it's dependent upon things going on in India to really force, if I'm correct here, Rick, the British to make some real decisions on where they're best suited at expending their energy, right? And does it not kind of point to the importance of, say, India versus, say, what becomes the United States in a global history here, that Britain was so focused on keeping those other colonies?
Yeah, I think you've hit on something really central. And this is something really central that the founders knew at the time and talk about. This is not me imposing an interpretation on what happened. This is me recognizing by reading their mail to each other what they're talking about. You can look at George Washington's correspondence and see that he is eager for the Continental Congress to get moving and get him some European allies who can bring him naval power, who can bring him supplies and uniforms and ammunition. He's desperate to be resupplied by the Dutch Caribbean or by money, gold from Spanish Cuba. We know that because he says it over and over again. When he finally gets word at Valley Forge that the French King Louis has finally joined in treaty with the Continental Congress, he has a parade. He has a parade at Valley Forge, and his soldiers all yell, "Long live King Louis." So Washington, this is his dream come true, the internationalizing, the globalizing of this war. If you look at Ben Franklin is, I think, after Washington, the most important and talented patriot leader. Like we said, you've got a kid named Benjamin. I would love to have a son named Benjamin for the same reason. I teach a whole class about it. And look where they put Benjamin, right? They send him out of Philadelphia, and he's in France for much of the war, not only trying to build that French alliance, but then trying to engineer other alliances through proxies like John Jay in Spain and John Adams in the Netherlands, and proxies in India with this guy, Ida Ali, that I mentioned before. So it was Patriot strategy to stretch the British military as thinly as possible, to pull it in as many directions as possible. Because as you said, Jason, if the British military, led by the Royal Navy, all concentrates on those 13 rebel colonies, it's only a matter of time before British military power really makes it very difficult for the Patriots to imagine a successful outcome. The way to keep hope alive is to bring in other allies, even as Britain itself is doing the same thing by bringing in all those German Hessians. So we could see that with Jamaica, and we see it with India. Those are really, Jamaica is a great example, Jason. Jamaica is the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and Britain wants to hold on to Jamaica way more than it minds about losing 13 rebel colonies on the mainland. And so Britain's Royal Navy ring fences Jamaica in a way that really draws down the strength of the Royal Navy from piling on off the coast of the 13 colonies. And it ring fences Jamaica, not because the Patriots are about to attack Jamaica, but because France and Spain are about to attack Jamaica. Same in India, right? Britain is sending precious ships it could be hurling at George Washington, and it's sending them to protect Bombay, as it was called then, Madras, and Calcutta, as it was called then, from French attack or Mysorean attack. So the grand strategy of the Patriots and their allies is to draw the British forces in all directions, meaning that Washington will have an easier path to securing territory and victory in the domestic theater.
Rick, I think you know that in my professional career, I work with tribes on a daily basis. It's a thing that I'm really passionate about, and I was really happy to see in this book this wonderful chapter starring someone centered around Molly Brandt. And when I got to that to the chapter, I was really happy about this, and I was kind of wondering. I feel like I would be doing myself a disservice to not talk about Native people during the war, and I was so happy that you did. Can we talk about the varying ways in which Native people throughout North America responded to? They saw this war coming. They knew it was happening. They had just fought in 7 Years' War just a few years earlier. What's going on in Indian country during the American Revolution?
There's a ton going on in Native America, right, during the year of the American Revolution. And we know that because of a generation of fantastic scholars of Native history. I drew a lot on the excellent work of Kathleen Duval, who probably needs no introduction to your viewers here, who's just, I would argue, one of the dean of sort of Native studies of this era. She wrote this fantastic book called Independence Lost, about how Native sovereignty is challenged by the American Revolution, especially in what she would call the Southwest back then, the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf Coast era. And then we've got, Alan Taylor wrote this great book 15 years ago called American Revolutions, which is sort of a continental history of the revolution. Then there's been scholars like, Colin Calloway and Neil Salisbury, and plenty of indigenous scholars themselves contributing to this. So I've learned a ton from all these folks. And what we learn from those folks is, Indian country is a central theater of the American Revolutionary War. And what was at stake in Native America for Native nations was palpable. It was land. They'd been fighting a very difficult sort of Cold War in the Trans-Appalachian West for decades to try to hold back the path of, white westward settlement. And they had a fragile alliance with the British government, which had drawn a proclamation line down the Appalachians saying our settlers should not go west of this line because it's going to antagonize our native allies who we need if we're going to beat France and Spain in any further wars. So for white settlers in backcountry communities, getting Britain's meddling out of their lives is actually one of the motivations to fight the American Revolution. And when the revolution comes to Native America, to the Trans-Appalachian West, Native peoples have to decide if they're going to stay out of it and watch these white people fight each other, or if they're going to choose a side for their own advantage. And understandably, given what's at stake here, territory and ultimately sovereignty, many native nations choose to wade in. And my students are often surprised to learn that most native nations wade in on the British side rather than the Patriot side. Not because the British are any more moral or trustworthy or any other moral virtue you can think of. They're not. But they seem like they're going to win. The British seem like they're going to win. And so why would you back what you think is going to be a losing team, especially when that losing team is not making any promises to, guarantee your land? The British are at least going through the motions of saying, yes, if we win, we will protect your land. We will help you protect your own land. And that's attractive enough a proposition for, I would say, about 80% of the native nations that choose a side choose the British side versus instead of the Patriot side, approximately 80-20, but don't write that down. We'll have Kathleen Duval on next week to correct the record there. So I focus on one person in one of those native nations, a woman named Molly Brant, that's obviously her English language name, who is a key, I would call her diplomat or stateswoman, who takes on the job of keeping the alliance between the British Empire and the Haudenosaunee Confederation, the Iroquois, together in sort of the upstate New York area. And her struggles to keep that alliance together as the natives and the British both lose stands in for the larger struggles to advance their agenda that many other native peoples faced in that era, both in the southern context, which Kathleen writes about, and then here in upstate New York, which is what I'm primarily focused on.
Yeah, I have a couple things I want to show you here. So here's my notebook that I kind of write as I'm going through here. And what you might not be able to see is like, I literally wrote, and this is not looking at your index. I was like, I feel Kathleen's independence lost here in my notes.
I hope you do. Yeah.
Oh, I absolutely do. Right. And I also,
I'll just interrupt you, Jason, to say
please.
that one of the compromises you have to live with when you write a book like this, it's called a trade book. It's aimed at the broadest readership possible, right? Is you don't get to do all the crediting of other scholars that you want to do in a book like that. You can't stop every sentence and say, as I learned from Kathleen Duval, right?
Right.
You only get to say that a couple of times, sometimes just in the acknowledgements or the footnotes. So what I love about your show is the chance to sort of acknowledge some of these other scholars like Cassandra Pybus and Kathleen Duval, who've taught me everything I know.
I felt there was another book that kind of centered on Haudenosaunee country. Joseph Glathar and James Kirby Martin, Forgotten Allies, right? I remember reading that book and reading about Joseph Brand, Molly, Diane Denegas was his name, right? And I remember I was like, I have rarely ever, Rick, been terrified by a man as I'm reading history. And I remember reading about Joseph Brand going, I am terrified. I am scared shitless about this man. Oh my gosh, he just has this larger than life. And I was so then your conscious decision to center this chapter not on Joseph but on Molly. I was like, this is something that Angela Pulley Hudson's always reminding me when I talk to her. She's like, Jason, where are the women? Where are the women? And I love that you did this. One of the things I think that I really wanted to talk, though, about is I think we know that in the American Revolution, the real losers of this war turned out to be Native people in North America. But there's a thing that you do in the book, which is to point towards Native people outside of the Americas and talk about what happens to them as a result of England focusing its efforts elsewhere. Can you talk a little bit about like maybe this transnational or global view of indigeneity and like what happens when the British Empire says, we're going to move on from America? What happens next?
Sure, that's right. So you're absolutely right to say that Native people, whether they backed the losing side, the British, or whether they backed the winning side, the Patriots, they do not get any of the guarantees and promises that had been sold to them as the price of their loyalty within the United States. In fact, the Treaty of Paris as I say in the book, cuts through Native America like a knife, displacing all sorts of Native communities, no matter which side you were on during the war. No Native people, of course, invited to the Paris peace negotiations, and yet the document is one of the most consequential for indigenous people in North America. But not just in the US. And that's the point I end that chapter on. I point out that the fate of indigenous people at the hands of the British Empire is no different, really, than the circumstances that indigenous people within the US have to face after American independence. Britain will try to build out Canada as a settler colony after the war, even after it's already relocated some of its former indigenous allies to Canada, and they find themselves in the way of Canadian westward expansion. And they face the equivalent of like Andrew Jackson era Indian removal, but that happens north of the border in the Canadian context, which we in America don't often think about. And we should also note that at the same time, Britain is expanding its footprint and its settler domains into southern Africa, into Australia, into New Zealand. We're in the 19th century now, just to be clear when I say these things. And we can say the same pattern that we see in the US of indigenous removal, indigenous disenfranchisement and dispossession being replicated in one British flag flying property after another around the world. So the techniques that will be used to dispossess indigenous people in Canada will then be perfected, if that's the horrific word, against the Maori and the Aborigine and the Xhosa in southern Africa as well. So the British Empire has a ton to answer for as a result of the consolidation of its empire after the American Revolution.
We have a segment here. It's a burgeoning segment. It's a segment we've done on occasion called What the Florida, Rick.
That's
I think
subtle. I like that, Jason. Very subtle. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I actually have to give credit to my great friend Lauren Lesab Shepherd. She helped me come up with it some time ago. She's an amazing scholar. But I've people who know me know that I'm from Kentucky, but they know my deep love of Florida. It's where my book I'm writing on is about. I've got a lot of folks in the Seminole tribe of Florida who I just adore, that I used to work for as well. I think Florida is one of these fascinating stories because we talk about the 13 colonies, but then there are these 2 colonies down. You talk about Pensacola. Can we talk a little bit about Spain and Florida? Because Spain always gets left out of this story. You got to this, and I was like, I know these guys. You start talking about cattle running into Florida. I'm like, I'm ready. Wait. Like, we talk about a little bit about Spain, about Florida, and what happens here? Why won't Florida play nice with the other colonies, Rick?
Right.
And why,
yes, that's right.
And why has that happened for 250 years?
I love this stuff. I could talk about Spain and Florida all night. So I'm glad
such
you
a fun
want to,
chapter.
because we've only got 6 hours left, so I'll try and be brief. And once again, Kathleen Duvall's work in Independence Lost, game-changing account that puts Florida back in the story. I learned a ton from that. We've also got a great new book that came out about 5 years ago about the role of France and Spain across the globe in the American Revolution, called Brothers at Arms by my friend Larry Ferreira. So he comes at it from the Madrid perspective. So, seeing it from the bottom up, from Kathleen's perspective on the ground in the Gulf Coast, and then from Larry's Madrid-centric perspective, together gives you this sense of what Spain was up to in the American Revolution. And it was up to a lot. If France is important, and it is, then Spain is what props France up, and France is propping up the Patriots in some sense or other. So you remove Spain, the whole house of cards falls apart. Spain is the money man, first of all, very deep-pocketed. Think of all those gold and silver mines in Peru and Mexico. They're literally financing the American Revolution. The American dollar is the Spanish dollar, right? They just changed the logo till it looks like a dollar logo. It's the Spanish dollar. And what you have in the Spanish government in Madrid, led by King Carlos III, I think, and his prime minister, Florida Blanca, is a real strategic effort to kick Britain as hard and as many times as it can while Britain is at war with itself here. Now, we often think of Britain and France as being age-old allies, which is true. Britain and Spain, age-old allies since the Spanish Armada, and they've barely stopped since 15 1788. And Spain, of course, just got its comeuppance, for lack of a better word, in the French and Indian War previously, where Spain had been one of the big losers. In fact, it gets out early; it's losing so badly. So Spain is desperate to recover a bunch of territories lost in that earlier war, all of which is to say, when Spain gets in, and by God, they choose their timing carefully, when Spain gets in, they go all in. I would say they sort of hulk out in terms of taking it to the British Empire. And so that means all sorts of geographies, which we don't think of as part of the American Revolution, see British soldiers and sailors and Spanish soldiers and sailors going at it. Two examples of that in Europe would be Spain tries to invade southern England in 1779. It doesn't go well, but it's the Second Spanish Armada. Spain tries to retake Gibraltar, this little rocky outcrop at Spain's southern tip in the Mediterranean that the British have held since, 1704 or something like that, and Spain's desperate to get back. And Jason, the longest and largest siege of the American Revolution is the Spanish siege of Gibraltar, which fails, by the way. And more people die there than any other campaign of the war, huge numbers of deaths. But then in the New World, despite those, setbacks of Spanish ambitions in the Old World, in the New World, Spain has victory after victory after victory. And in Central America, in Illinois, did you know the Spanish were attacking in Illinois? Who knew? But the greatest victory of all is Florida. The greatest victory of all is West Florida, which was one of two British Florida colonies, West and East back then. Spain sends its best guy, the governor of Spanish Louisiana, Bernardo de Galvez, to try to seize British West Florida and maybe even East Florida. And he just annihilates the British and their allies, marching from one place to another, from Mobile eventually to Pensacola. And his victory at Pensacola is not just impressive on its own terms, but its consequences ricochet across the world, sending all sorts of troops to go stick it to Lord Cornwallis, who would otherwise still be bogged down in the Floridas had it not been for Galvez's victory there. And as a result, Spain takes formal control of both Floridas, so it becomes Spanish Florida once again. Of course, it had been Spanish Florida back before 1760 or so, so you could say Galvez is making Florida Spanish again, and he does. But that doesn't last too long, because Andrew Jackson is also a 13-year-old boy in the American Revolutionary War, and when he grows up to be a big boy, he's going to invade Spanish Florida and seize it for what's then the United States. So even though Florida's outside of the 13 rebel colonies, what happens in Florida is hugely important to the geopolitical states. It's all a domino effect. If anyone's seen the cover of my book, it's got this sort of graphic image of dominoes falling. And that's sort of what we're talking about here, that one thing leads to another. There are butterfly effects, there are ripple effects all around the world. And the importance of Florida to the story of Yorktown is one example of that.
Yeah, I think maybe all of this kind of points, and you're kind of pointing this right now, is one of the great strengths here is and you talk about this early in the book and throughout the book, right? This war is the American victory is never inevitable. It's every time I go back to look at it, Rick, and I think about it, I constantly think, how did they pull this off? I'm constantly, it's weird. It's like watching a movie and expecting the ending to change, because every time I go back to reevaluate or to reimagine this era in American history, I'm constantly shocked at the outcome. I was like, how does this happen? And it's like, look, there's all of this crazy stuff that happens, and you can't look at it in a singly American, continental perspective. I want to ask you one last question, which is this. We know that after 1783, the United States emerges triumphantly and has a happy and completely peaceful existence for the next 250 years, and things are completely fine, and nothing bad ever happens ever again. What's the effect on England, on the empire, losing this war? Is it a shock to I think about the United States coming out of Vietnam, thinking, wait a second, we lost? Is this like, oh, well, whatever, it's fine? Like, what happens to England after
I love that
1783?
parallel you just made to the US after Vietnam. And I'm not an expert
Thank
on the
you.
20th century, but that resonates for me, right? Because the American Revolutionary War had for the British become a quagmire, right? Become something they were bogged down in and really struggling to really make a game changing move to either win or extricate themselves from with dignity. Um, and that's quite the contrast to how the British went into the war, right? You can read both the public and private comments of King George III, of his Prime Minister, Lord North, and they talk about basically a quick campaign of subjugation to teach these boys a lesson, and we'll be home by Christmas. Every British war has always begun with the Prime Minister saying, "Don't worry, boys, you'll be back by Christmas," and they're never back by Christmas. Spoiler alert: they're never back by Christmas. So they share the same sense that you just laid out in your question there. That if you looked at the odds of the Patriots winning this thing in 1775 or 1776, they would be long odds, right? Because all the odds are stacked against them. Britain has the largest navy in the history of the world. Surely Britain can just strangle these rebels into economic submission. Its army isn't bad either, but its army is not nearly as powerful as its navy. That if we can keep this as a contest within the British Empire, if it's only a civil war, then maybe Britain has a very strong chance of winning. Certainly, there's a lot of confidence and optimism when the war starts in Britain that this will be over quickly. That proves to be naive because they underestimate just how many Americans are either undecided or, more importantly, patriots. They think it's just a few bad apples who are patriots. Like if we can round up John Hancock and Paul Revere and take them out of the game, then we'll have nipped this thing in the bud. That's garbage, of course, as a military strategy, because the insurgency spreads and spreads and spreads and metastasizes. But they also are gambling, and this is where they lose their money, that it will remain within the confines of the British Empire, that the Patriots will not be able to enact a strategy to create a multinational, multilateral coalition. They think France will stay on the sidelines. They think Spain will stay on the sidelines. And it's a wake-up call when France and Spain start covertly supplying the Patriots with guns and ammo long before they sign a formal alliance. That's a very bad sign for the British there. So I think the odds of who's going to win are changing all the time, and I honestly don't think it's over until it's over. Though I do think France and Spain joining is one of a giant setback. And we should remind ourselves here that even though we're talking a lot today about foreign actors and entanglements, that what George Washington does throughout all these difficult early years is not surrender, is not capitulate, is not get cornered, right? That's his great gift to the Patriot War effort. No, battlefield victory makes a huge difference. The Battle of Trenton is a nice morale boost. The Battle of Saratoga is a nice morale boost. It's good for recruitment, but it doesn't ultimately change the stakes of the war. But every day he doesn't capitulate. Every day he avoids being cornered. That is effectively another day that this global strategy, led by people like Ben Franklin out and about around the world, can live, right? Can survive, can try to move that ball. So huge credit to the Continental Army and George Washington for holding out in the resilient, sort of stick-to-itive way they did. But it's all improvised. It's all full of weird reversals and strange bedfellows. Like if we look at it from another context, Jason, how odd is it that the Patriots' main allies are a Muslim autocrat 10,000 miles away, a French Catholic king, and a Spanish empire builder, right? The Patriots, on the face of it, anti-colonial, anti-monarchical white Christians would seem to have nothing in common with their essential allies. But, wars make for strange bedfellows, and Franklin and Washington, the others, understood that from day one, I think.
Rick, there's so much here. And I'm not kidding when I say I could talk to you about this book for hours, because I so enjoyed it so very much. And there's so much I think I would learn from you in talking about this. we've got the 250th anniversary of the nation coming up this next year in 2026. And I wonder, we talk a lot about memory here on this podcast. I think a lot about how we remember things and so forth. So I guess the question I have is not actually about the past, but actually of the future. And in closing, can I ask, is the world a better place off with a United States, with the American victory, with a United States of America? And in tandem, how should we be remembering as we think about this uh, 250 years in? How do we need to remember this American Revolution?
Wow, that's a big one, right?
Good luck.
I'm going to dodge some of it, right? I'm going to
Sure.
dodge the 20th and 21st century parts of that question because that's not
Please.
my expertise and it's
Right.
not my place. I'll leave it to people who know what they're talking about to weigh that sort of stuff. But maybe I'll say two or three things here. One is to say that we have an opportunity to remember the American Revolution in 2026 as something complicated and messy and chaotic and much closer to what it actually was than the sort of mythic romantic stories we have habitually told ourselves on these anniversary moments, most recently in 1976 at the bicentennial, for instance. And I hope we seize that opportunity because we live now in a highly entangled, globalized world, and it should make intuitive sense to people to realize that it's been that way for a while. And the 18th century, too, was a globalized and entangled world. And for the patriots to do what they did required coalition building and partnerships, and that it was never just America first back in 1776. It was, America among, I think, right? Never America alone would be the way I would think about the opportunity we have there if we're reflecting on current foreign policy. Whether the U.S. was good for its allies at the time, that's an interesting question to pose. And I talk a little bit about this in the book. We could answer that, vis-a-vis France and the coming of the French Revolution, but let's do it with Spain.
Please.
I'll just say quickly that Spain pours everything into its alliance with the Patriots, hoping to really knock Britain down to size and thinking that the fledgling United States will eventually end up in Spanish orbit, basically sort of a vassal state of Spanish America. And that vision proves to be deeply unrelated to what actually happens. They think of the early U.S. as what they called a pygmy, a not very powerful foreign entity, which is how it began. But the U.S. Ambition for Western land actually ramps up pretty quickly after American independence. And so the pygmy rapidly becomes a giant, if I could use this awful language, by the 19th century. So if we look at the expansion of the United States from 13 states in 1783 to 20, 30, 40, now 50, almost all of that expansion is on land that in 1775 was claimed by the throne of Spain. The lower 48 states right now, 3/4 of them sit on land that was owned by Spain at the start, or claimed by Spain, I should say, at the start of the war. So from the Spanish perspective, you might say, the long view, that was the worst investment they ever made. Right. But if I could make a more positive point, Jason, I'm going to draw on the work of David Armitage here, the great historian at Harvard University, who wrote this terrific little book called something like the Global Declaration of Independence or something like that. And that little book reminds us that we often have simplified and sanitized the Declaration of Independence, that it's not just this proclamation of sovereignty that, like a magic snap of the fingers, makes the Americans free, that it's a document of state-making, trying to declare to the world that this is not a civil war within the British Empire, this is a secession movement out of the British Empire designed to create a new state to become the United States of America. And Armitage argues, and I think he's onto something here, that act of announcing that intention inaugurates the genre of declaration making in the modern world. And so many other rebels and separatists and political freedom seekers in subsequent generations decide to make the same move because they've seen it work in the American Revolution. They declare their independence, sometimes aspirationally, sometimes they fail to achieve it, and sometimes they do it after the fact, but they declare independence to show, look, we are a state. And that legacy, which is the American Declaration's legacy, has spread to, I think, more than half of the countries in the world right now have authored declarations of independence. And depending on how you count, the American is the first one. So I think that's a legacy that really has brought a real challenge to the great age of empires in the world, and it's brought on our modern era of the nation state. I, for instance, think that's an excellent thing. I don't think empires are stable or admirable in the abstract. So I'm delighted to see that the American Declaration has done its part to move us out of a world of empires and into a world of sovereign nation states.
I feel like that's just the perfect way to kind of close out this conversation about this amazing book that I got to read over the last couple of days. I'm hoping folks are going to get to. I have one last question. What's next for you? Have you already thought about the next project? Are you the kind of person who's constantly working on a bunch of different stuff? I can't do it. I don't have the capacity. I'm too easily distracted. But like, what comes up, Rick? What do you do next? Like, what follows this?
I've got some book ideas, and I haven't even told my wife some of these ideas yet, so I should probably tell her before I tell all of you guys. But I will say, yeah, I like all of you. I'm super curious. I want to keep learning about stuff I don't know. I actually just wrapped up a much smaller project, not a book-length project, but I wrapped up a course of lectures. Public lectures, which are going to be available on the Great Courses, one of these lifelong learning websites, which is popular in libraries and around the country. And that's going to be a deep dive into the American Revolution. If you heard me just go off about the Declaration with such enthusiasm there, it's because I've been reading deeply in the historiography of the Declaration over the last roughly 9 months and just finished writing these 12 lectures, which will end up on the Great Courses, I think in April of 2026, just in time, of course, for July 2026. And then I've mentioned Franklin a couple of times. I don't think my next book will be about the founders or the revolution. I think I'm going to write a book maybe about railroads and slavery next. But at some point before I die, Jason, there's a Franklin book in me somewhere. And I've been teaching Franklin this semester, and I've been really noticing just how many times he crosses the Atlantic in the 18th century, which is a very rare thing for anyone who's not a sailor to do. He does it 8 times at a time when most people do it once or never. And each of those crossings, I think, is really meaningful to him personally and symbolically important as he makes a transition from one life stage to another. And I think it's also a good metaphor for his swirling and changing political identities, and also his second guessing of those identities. And so I think I'm going to write a book at some point in my life called Franklin at Sea, embodying all of that, but that's a ways off.
Sign me up. I will invest in this book right now. Rick, I can't tell you how excited I was. I had this date scheduled, just circled on my calendar. I was really, like I told you, I was really loving reading the book. And then you and I have many mutual friends who were like, "You're going to love Rick. He's the best." So many of our friends just raved about you. And I asked, like, "Who's Rick Bell?" And they were like, "You're going to love him." And this has been the best. So I can't thank you enough for coming in and talking to me about your work, this book, everything else under the sun. This has been a blast. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. And now I can drop this fake British accent I've been doing for the last hour and a half and go back to my regular Texas twang.
Oh, lovely. And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Rick Bell, for coming on. Thank you for talking to us about your book. Everybody go out and get this book. It's amazing, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. Thank you to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for being here and producing this show. And thank you to all of you for continuing to be part of this community. Share this with your friends. Share it with people that you know. Help us grow. Thanks for now. Ciao for now. You know the words. Bye.